Hey, before we get into this episode, have you seen that my new book is out? It's called Stop Selling and Help Them Buy Weddings and Events. And it's a book that you helped me write because you would ask me at a conference, which of your books has what you just spoke about on stage? And if it wasn't in any of my books, I'd say it's in the next one. Well, here it is. Here's the next one. How to respond to reviews. What if you don't like doing sales? The 3 questions to ask every prospect, or they can't ask for what they don't know exists. These are just some of the chapters in there. And the beauty is you don't have to read it front to back. You can jump around to any chapter, kind of like my other book, Wit, Wisdom, and the Business of Weddings, where you can jump to any chapter because they're not necessarily connected to one another. And if you want to get free shipping on a paperback copy, go to shopalanberg.com and use the coupon code podcast. That's shopalanberg.com. Use the coupon code podcast. Get free shipping on me. Otherwise, it's on Audible. It's on Kindle. And if you go to podcast.allenberg.com, the links are all there as well. Thanks. Can your contract be only 500 words? Listen to my next guest and find out. Welcome to another episode of the Wedding Business Solutions Podcast. I'm your host, Alan Berg. I'm a speaker, author, sales trainer, website reviewer, and I help businesses like yours sell more, profit more, and have more fun doing it. Enjoy this episode. Hi, it's Alan Berg. Welcome back to another episode of the Wedding Business Solutions Podcast. I am so glad to have my friend Sarah Fox on from 500 Words. How you doing, Sarah?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much, Alan.
Well, thank you for joining me because we met at the PSA UKI, which is the Professional Speakers Association of the UK and Ireland, where I actually was presenting, and you presented as well. And in just chatting, and I love the hallways and I love the meals and stuff, chatting and finding out what you do. And you are a recovering lawyer, is that correct?
Yeah, that's how I badge myself.
So what does it mean to be a recovering lawyer?
It means that I've spent 15 years in a large corporate law firm. I've done all the legal training. I'm technically on the roll of solicitors, but I don't refer to myself as a solicitor, and I don't run a law firm anymore. So whilst I do a little bit of legal work, I call myself a recovering lawyer, so people don't get confused.
So what does 500 words, where did that come from?
Oh, so I'm a qualified trainer as well as a qualified lawyer, and I was training people on contracts, and I just more and more I realized that nobody understood what they were looking at. They couldn't read it. I couldn't give them examples. They were all too long. If I couldn't just I tell you what, just read that for 5 minutes and then we'll talk about it, because there was nothing short enough to do. So I wanted to introduce a tool that allowed us to talk through the principles of what we needed in a contract, and they could say what they liked, what they didn't like, that kind of thing. So my sister challenged me to write one in 500 words, and I went away because I like a dare. So I went away and wrote one and started to use it as a training tool. And it kind of snowballed, because when people read it, they went, "Hey, I like this. Can we have it?" And I was like, no, you can't. Obviously, it's not designed for what it wasn't designed to be a serious piece of business, if you see what I mean. But it's turned into that.
So other than the details, right? We're talking about more of the legalese contract stuff can be 500 words. Obviously, they're going to have details, because we have people listening that are caterers, and they're going to have the food there and other things like that. So what we're talking about is the contractual terms of the agreement, not including the details of what you're going to do, the specific things there. So what are some of the things that you took out the legalese and that we can make a lot simpler?
Oh, well, you can make almost everything a lot simpler. So the problem is, over the years, we've had, formal contracts for about 150 years when we started writing them down, and courts started reinforcing them or enforcing them in the UK. So that we've had a long time to just kind of get a bit long-winded. Certainly when lawyers were first appointed, they were kind of paid by the length. So long contracts made them more money. People thought they were more sophisticated, so it was in their interest to pad a little. And then the invention of copy and paste and Microsoft Word made it even easier to just pad things out and make it longer, without actually adding any value. Because fundamentally, we've got away from contracts as a tool to help you do business, and that's essentially what we all want to do. We want to do business. We want to do what we love, whether a caterer, a photographer, a lawyer, podcast host, whatever.
Mhm.
We don't want a lot of side stuff. It's not that we like the sound of our own voice, although as a speaker, you and I both like the sound of our own voice in
Yeah,
some
sure.
respects. But it's really important that we focus on what's important to other people. And the framework is about saying who's doing it, how they're doing it, how that might change, what happens if things start to go wrong, that kind of thing. It's not about what might happen when it does go wrong. It's about how you work together to make it go right. What does right look like? What does success look like on this project? And often when we write the things like scope and payment, we're good at that. We don't actually think of it from the client's perspective or the buyer's perspective. So it's also about kind of talking in the language of both parties.
So the way I always look at contracts is it's to protect both of us,
Yeah.
protect both, right? So that we understand, we're clear.
Yep.
We say good fences make good neighbors. Well, good, clear contract terms make good customer relationships. So all of the legal terminology is not required by law, correct?
Yeah, under English law, and in fact under
Any
American
law.
laws and different state laws, you don't need to have particular formulas of wording. Now, a lot of lawyers will say, "Well, we have to use that word because it's been tried and tested." Now, that's lawyer speak for failed once because it's gone to court. Now, I don't know about you, but if people kept giving me something because it's failed once, but come through, okay, that's not necessarily as a positive a statement about something as we might like it to be.
Right.
So there's nothing that says we have to kind of turn into some sort of robotic geek speak or chat GPT version of a lawyer in order to write our deals. We don't need that. You don't need it. I don't need it. Clients don't need it. Buyers don't need it. Nobody likes it. But we've become used to it. And people really struggle when you change and move away from the norm. But, we don't write books the way Chaucer or Dickens or Twain wrote them anymore. We write them in different language. So we can do the same with our contracts. We can go 21st century with our contract words as well as in other places.
And the other thing I see is we shouldn't be punishing the masses for the ills of a few. So just because something did go wrong once doesn't mean we have to write it in as clause number 83, item D, because it might happen again.
Yeah.
Realistically, everybody's goal is to make their customers happy,
Yeah.
satisfies them, do that. And if something goes wrong, make them happy. And there you go. So what would be the advice you have for people that their contracts have become like your attic or your garage where stuff goes in, but it never comes out? What are some of the things where we can start, crossing out and saying, okay, we don't need this. We don't need this. What do you see? What are some of the common things that you see that are just like, it's not necessary?
So there's a whole lot of stuff at the back which is called boilerplate, and it might have titles like severance or discharge or waiver, all that kind of stuff. If you don't understand the title, you probably don't understand the content. But fundamentally, when I talk to people about how they're like reading and negotiating contracts, is you ask yourself, what is this meant to do? Not what does it mean, but what's it meant to do? Does it change behavior? Does it reinforce behavior we want? Or is it just word soup? If it's word soup, we can get rid of it. The lawyers will tell us there's a very, there may be a risk in getting rid of it, or it may protect us in, 1 out of a million cases, whatever.
Right.
But fundamentally, we need to focus on the key things about creating understanding. As you said, one of the most important purposes for a contract is to manage the client's expectations. So we both understand we're singing from the same sheet. So we're in harmony with each other. We're not trying to sing one set of lyrics to another set of music that doesn't really fit.
Right.
So we need to ask, what is it meant to do? What is this clause in there for? Is it because it made someone's ego feel better? Is it because we were running out of space on the page? Or is it because we just wanted to build some more money? Right. If it doesn't do anything and you don't really understand it, you can ask, do I really need it? Right. And a lot of the time, the answer to that is a simple no, not really.
Yeah. Right.
Because we know such a very, 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 very small, tiny, tiny percentage of contracts ever get to a serious dispute where lawyers get involved. We don't need to write it for that very small percentage that the lawyers get involved. But the other thing you were talking about is having reflected all the things that have ever gone wrong in your business in the past and trying to clamp it down and stop it happening again. Right. And one of my mentors used to say that you could tell the extent of a business person's paranoia by the length of their contract. And we've all read contracts. I mean, I read contracts, but if you have read
Yeah.
contracts,
Yes.
you may spot what's happened in the past because there's a clause in it about it. You know, I have a tandem. Me and my husband have a tandem, and we do a lot of cycling. And we had it refurbished just before lockdown in 2019. And the contract with the people who were doing it, you could tell what had happened in the past because there was a clause bitching about this client, a clause, and they didn't name them, but
Right.
you could feel the visceral reaction they'd had to all these things that had gone wrong. But it's like, well, hang on, I'm not Mr. Bloggs or Ms. Smith or, you know, Joe,
Right.
who, you know, treated you badly, who was a
Right.
terrible client. I'm me, and I want you to start off trusting me, because if you don't trust me, I don't kind of know whether we should be doing business at all.
Right. So I think some of the big things, certainly what came up during COVID, force majeure was something that was on so many people's boilerplate contracts that they never knew. And to find out that A, they didn't know it was there, B, it wasn't there, C, it was there, but it had limitations to what it covered and things like that. I think this is one of those situations where should we be worried about that happening again? Or should it just be, here's what we're going to do. Here's what you're going to do. If we can't perform, here's what happens. If you want to cancel, here's what happens. I mean, do we
Yeah.
need force majeure or just no?
No.
Okay.
So there's a couple of ways of dealing with it. I always say that if you've got a really good change mechanism that basically says if either of us wants to change this deal, then we'll just have a grown-up conversation about it. Then that's a good way, because that doesn't say when you can change it or why you want to change it. So that covers everything from war and sanctions and force
Right.
majeure and pandemics and restrictions
Right.
and government rules and all this kind of stuff. The other thing you can just, instead of talking about force majeure, which in English law doesn't even exist, it's a French law concept. So, you know, great. But you can just talk about circumstances beyond our control.
Right.
So
Okay.
you can have a clause that deals with change that's really nice and wide, because really, if you want to work with someone, you want to work with them so that you're both happy. If you're not both happy, you may need to change it. I don't think that's a problem.
Right.
You just need to talk about it like grown-ups. Then you might have a circumstances beyond our control clause that says, you know, if this happens and we can't perform, then we'll have another grown-up conversation about it.
Right.
And then the third thing is to have some sort of termination or cancellation provision, which basically says if the whole thing becomes completely impossible, or for whatever reason we don't want to continue with this, let's work out how we split up amicably. And I think you can get really prescriptive. You can say, oh no, let's put terms in that says we have to change it like this. And if there's force majeure, if there's government restrictions, then we'll do X, Y, and Z. But we don't know what the next pandemic is going to be in terms of the way it will disrupt contracts. So why are we trying to guess now what the future is going to hold? Why don't we just say, if the future looks really weird and unprecedented, and all the words that we used during the 2020, we'll just have a grown-up conversation, because, you know, we will be different people because we'll have been through that, or will we be in that. We can't predict what's needed. And I know that's been really difficult for the events industry, where lots of things were cancelled at the last minute. They didn't have contacts to talk to. They were losing money, and then they've come back a bit tentatively. So it is a difficult decision to kind of say, I'm not going to be too prescriptive in my contract, because that feels like a risk. But I think actually it's probably the 21st century way of doing business, is to reflect that we can't control everything. We just have to have really good grown-up conversations.
Right. And we should say that this is not direct legal advice, and you should talk to your lawyer, who's probably not going to like the fact that your contract is going to get cut down because they might have written it. There you go. But I think we should worry less about the pandemic type of force majeure things than the things that might actually happen more often, which is somebody books you for a wedding and then they call off the wedding. Now what happens, right? So I think those type of things I would still maybe leave in to
Yeah,
say,
completely.
right, if you need to cancel, not because of, these other things, this is what's going to happen, so that it's clear. And that's not punishing the masses for the ills of a few. It's saying this is more likely to happen, so let's write it in there, versus the stuff that's less likely to happen, like war and pandemic
Volcanic eruptions, all kind of stuff. And I
right,
think you don't have to say why they want to cancel. If they want to cancel, they don't want you anymore.
right,
You're not just hanging around like a gooseberry.
right,
You
right,
know, it's like being told a party's off, but turning up anyway because it's booked in. We don't want to do that in business any more than we want to do that in our personal lives.
Right.
But if you said, if you want to cancel, well, I've suffered some costs. I've had that date in my diary. I've turned away work. So it's cost me
Right.
some money. So I'd like to be compensated, and you can agree what those terms are. And, people come to me and say, well, what should I write in my contract? It's like, whatever makes you happy.
Right.
Because if it makes you happy, then you'll be a better person and you'll be a better supplier if you're contracting on terms that you like. Don't wait for somebody else to tell you how to live your life and run your business and everything else. You can decide. And then if the client doesn't like it, or if the supplier doesn't like it, you can negotiate, but at least know what your baseline is. Where would you really like to be at the end of that conversation with a new client or a new supplier? Build that in from the beginning, and build it in when you're not in a hurry, when you're not trying to do the last minute. Oh my God, we've got something happening in December and I haven't actually got that written down yet. Oops. Do it in January,
Right.
Make a clean sweep of it and just think about what you would like it to say so that it reflects your business, your values, your personality. All the reasons you went into business can go into your contract. There's no reason why you can't have personality in your contract, why you can't have nice tone of voice in your contract, why you can't have a little bit of humor even in your contract. There's no law against humor in legal documents. It's just that lawyers aren't great at pretending to be humorous on behalf of someone else, shall we say.
Well, I've seen that in very few, unfortunately, agreements where there is personality in there, and it's talking just as if it's speaking to you and saying, here's what it is. Something else that I see coming up is suppliers complaining that the customer didn't do something or wanted something different, but the contract said, right? And they're going back to what the contract. And my first question is the contract clear? Is it the boilerplate language? Is it all these things? That's the first thing. And the second thing is the customer's always right. So can we just do what the customer wants? Is there any reason not to? One of my favorite phrases, I use it in my speaking. Mika Solomon said this on Forbes. The answer is yes. Now, what was the question?
Yeah.
And so we're trying to make the customers happy. One thing that I've recommended to people is if there are things that you need them to know, don't assume that in the fine print on the back of the agreement on page 4 and line 102 that they're going to read it, because we all just kind of scan and sign and we do those things, is to separate that into 10 things you need to know. And these are the things that actually happen, such as your bridal party can't bring their own alcohol, to the venue, right? Things like that, because, telling them, we know I know that it's not accurate, but we remember 40% of what we hear and 60% of what we read, and 38% of all statistics are made up. So, we know that. So telling them that when they signed up, and then a year from now, expecting them to remember that,
Yeah.
you're at fault. You're at fault with this.
Yeah.
So can you go to them and say, here's the 7 things that you need to know, and get that to them sooner? Get that on a separate piece of paper. Get that on a separate thing.
And send it to them a week before and a month before. We've just applied for a visa to go to France, and it's, we turned up and they said, have you got this piece of paper? It's like, it's not on your checklist. Oh, but it's obvious. No, I've never done this before, so it's not obvious to me. They said, we have loads of people turning up without that piece of paper, in which case your process is at fault, not the client, not the customer. It's your process. So think through every time something goes slightly awry at an event, think, oh, how can I stop that happening again? One of the things that I do in my contracts is always make sure the first page is basically a summary. So, for a wedding, it'll be who's getting married, where are they getting married? What time does it start? What time am I needed? What time does it finish? What time I am needed till? Those are not always the same question. How much are you paying me? What are you expecting me to provide? That kind of stuff. And then the next things are what I will do and what you will do in list form. So they've got it. And it's the first thing they read. Because it kind of means if they get bored of reading your contract, and with 500 words-ish, they don't get that bored, to be quite honest. But if they read nothing, they read the stuff that you need them to know first. That's the way that we write press articles, journal articles, the important stuff first. But contracts, we just scatter it anywhere under some random heading that the lawyers have chosen as a topic that makes sense to them, but it doesn't make sense to clients.
Right.
So I'm with you. Make it really simple. And if you've got a checklist for your happy couple that you want them to do, send it to them. And if you're really good, you'll collaborate with all the other suppliers and you'll have one single checklist for all the suppliers that makes it clear exactly what that happy couple have to do before their event to make sure that everyone gets the bits of information and the bits of the pie that they need on the day. I mean, it's not pie on a wedding day. It's always cake, isn't it? But
Well, you could have whatever you want. It could be cupcakes.
no.
It could be donuts. But so what you're describing is what I typically do in an email, which is I literally put a heading. It says, here's what I'm going to do. And then there are bullet points. And then here's what you're going to do, right? And what they're going to do includes how much they're paying, when the deposit is, when the other payment or payments are due. And then at the bottom, I put, because it's in an email, is there anything on here that you would like me to adjust, or should we move forward? And if they come back and say, let's move forward, and I send them a link to the deposit and they pay the deposit, that's a deal.
Ka-ching.
That's a deal.
Yeah.
I don't feel that a signature changes anything because they responded and they said okay, right? So the idea of signatures, which again to this day still people are sending me things I need to print out,
Oh, print,
sign.
sign, scan, and return. No,
Yeah,
no, no. I've said to people before the pandemic, actually, it was really interesting because in the pandemic, it did change the way lawyers thought about getting stuff signed.
right.
But I've just said, if it's simple enough, put it in the body of the email and just say, hit reply with a hell yes, if that's your personality, or a
Sure.
shh yes, if it's,
Mm-hmm.
but if that's good enough, we don't need signatures. And actually, a lot of the legal jurisdictions are now saying if you reply to an email with a yes or a hell yes, and that's an agreement, then that's good enough. That is a signature for all practical purposes and all legal purposes. So, let's stop this. Print, sign, scan, and return.
Right.
The more barriers we put in
Right.
their way, the less likely they are to say yes.
And the money, if they've paid the deposit and they've said hell yes,
Good enough.
there's a good enough deal there. So let's just recap what you're saying here. Page one, the major details, right?
Yep.
The date, the time, the customer's name and contact information, when you're going to be there, not what your deliverables are from at least from a higher level, right? We can get into the
Yeah, yeah.
weeds, right? Like the caterers, you don't need the food, the menu on that page. You need to have those things. You'll have that
We're
on
providing
it.
catering, so they can tell that you're the caterer, not the photographer or the
Right.
flowers or whatever on
Right.
the first page. Yeah,
Right. So the first page really can be almost the same for everybody. It's just a
yeah,
couple little heading details that are going to change that. And then getting into the weeds, into those other things. But then even I'm going to do the quotes here, air quotes, legalese for those of you just listening. It doesn't have to be legalese. It just be
yeah,
headings that say, what happened? What about cancellation? What about this? What about that? And I love to use questions because the number one way people search on Google and YouTube is questions anyway. So why not ask the question and answer the question? It's almost
yeah.
like, so your contract is almost FAQs.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that really annoys me, because I do a lot of contract simplification for big corporates, and often they have kind of data under loads of different clauses. They have intellectual property clauses, and they have confidentiality clauses, and they have data protection clauses. It's like, well, how about we just have one title that says how we will share and use data? And people go, oh, yeah, well, we could do that. It's like, okay, so let's think about somebody reading this, because one of the principles of plain language is that you can understand it when you read it, and that's first time. So you don't need to go back, you don't need to reread it, you don't need to have a hot coffee or a hot drink or whatever.
Or a legal dictionary.
Yeah, or a legal dictionary. You can read it at first time, but also you can find what you need easily. And finding what you need means really good titles that just make sense to the person using it, not to lawyers who've been to law school, who've read the manual of style of contract drafting or whatever. It needs to be useful to me, to you, to all the people involved, and to people who are time poor, busy, and stressed. And we know that on a wedding day and before a wedding day, there's a lot of decisions to make, a lot of people to meet, a lot of contracts to sign. You want to make it easy as possible, make their lives easy. This is a really celebratory occasion. And I've yet to see a contract for a celebratory occasion that makes me go, yes, oh, I am so excited for this. They've normally made me feel like most contracts do. Oh, wow, yeah. Okay.
So part of transparency, we know transparency breeds trust. Just imagine as a customer, if someone handed you a contract that you could actually read and they were happy to go through those titles with you and say, if you have any questions, here's what happens with this, here's what happens with that. If you'd like some time to read it, that's fine. And if they're like, no, it's right there, there you go. And then they can sign off on it or e-sign off on it or however they're going to do that. imagine how much better they're going to feel about you in this whole transaction. The fact that thinking about weddings and events, they don't happen tomorrow. They happen months, a year or more down the line. The trust factor in, I'm giving you money, I'm signing this now. Wow, I feel even better about you now.
Yeah.
Instead of you handed me 4 pages of boilerplate, which I would imagine that a good percentage of people listening got their agreement from someone else, got a contract from someone else, downloaded a
Okay.
boilerplate agreement or something like that, which is just perpetuating this whole, well, it's in there, it must be good.
I saw it on the internet. It must be true.
Exactly. So just be clear, make it easy, let them read it the first time and say, yes, this is exactly, I understand exactly what this is. Legalese is not necessary. And then don't punish the masses for the ills of a few. Everything doesn't have to be in there. And just make your customers happy. And then when it goes south, make that customer happy. There's another episode I did, Sarah, which is what would you pay to make it go away?
Hmm.
And it's about the negative review or not getting the negative review because you avoided that because you did something, and how I've spoken about this and many times. Yes, you need to give them something more than what you feel is necessary, but then the bad review doesn't happen, the bad reputation doesn't happen, all those things don't happen.
But, be generous when things are going about to go right, and be generous when things have just gone a little bit pear-shaped. But, one of the things you were saying is, if you give it over to your client, you should be proud of what you're giving them because you're proud of your business. If you're embarrassed by it, it reflects on your business. But if you don't understand what you've given them because you copied and pasted it off the internet, yada, 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 then if they ask you a question, what are you going to say? Oh, well, I don't really understand, but, it's in there. Is that a good enough reason to put something in?
Yeah.
That's not how we do anything else. That's like making a cake and going, well, somebody said kippers. I don't know why, but I copied it off the internet. It seems to, everybody else has got kippers in their cake. It must make sense. It's like, really? That
Yeah.
doesn't make sense to anybody. I think there
Yeah.
may be a typo somewhere along the line.
And then
But,
it just keeps
and it
going.
perpetuates and
Right.
perpetuates.
Yeah.
And I remember there's a joke about a woman who, when she was cooking a fish, she always used to she cut the heads and tail off it and cooked the fish in the pan. And she said, well, why do you do that? I said, oh, well, my mum used to do it. So she asked her mum, she said, well, why do you do it? She goes, well, Granny used to do it. And she turned around to Granny and said, why do you do it? I said, well, my pan wasn't big enough. So they're perpetuating something they never understood
Right.
just because it's not good enough in the 21st century for building trust, building transparency, building decent relationships.
Yeah, I heard a similar one. There was a bench at a military base, and there was somebody standing guard at the bench. And he asked his supervisor, why do I need to stand guard? He said, well, when I was a grunt like you, I had to stand guard. And we've always had someone, well, why? And then it goes back and it goes back and it goes up 3 generations. And they find this 100-year-old general. And why do we have somebody standing guard? He goes, is the paint still wet?
Yeah.
Same thing. We don't understand why, and that's it. And when I send someone an email that has all the things laid out, and they say, "Can you send me an official agreement?" I'm like, "There it is."
That's it.
Like there it is. But their legal department or thing. I've twice now been asked for my liability insurance when someone is going to an event at another place, not my place, another
Mhm.
place, and they want my liability insurance as if I was coming into their venue. I'm like, I'm not coming to your place. But no,
Yeah.
our people need that. It's like, fine, here it is. But do
Yeah.
you
So sometimes we do have to reflect that other buyers have a tick list of things they want to see to feel comfortable or in order
right,
to get you on their supplier list.
right.
And sometimes we have to play the game.
Yeah,
And it's not great because it doesn't make sense sometimes for some of those questions to be asked. And yeah, I've had the same. But we know that that's a small proportion of the people
right.
we do business with, and we just have to say, okay, I'll play the game for that small proportion. But for everyone else, let's do it in a way which is fun and celebratory and just positive. And I'm such a fan of positivity in contracts, and I did an A to Z of contracts, which was all positive adjectives about them being magnanimous or joyful or kind or whatever, because I think there's too much negativity associated with what is the beginning of a beautiful relationship. It
Right.
might be a business relationship, but fundamentally, it should be the beginning of a beautiful relationship.
Right. All right. Last question. Occasionally, people tell me, and this used to happen to me when I was in the corporate world, is the customer's lawyer, or the customer is a lawyer, and they start redlining things in your contract terms. So the redlining meaning they go in and they cross out, there are things that they're not going to agree to. What would you say?
Well, I'd always ask them why.
Mhm.
Because sometimes it's a style issue, they don't like the way you've written it, but most often it's not reflecting the commercial transaction. And I've been in negotiations where the lawyers didn't get the full picture from the client, and they went in and the suppliers are going, well, that's not what we agreed, and that's not what we agreed. And that's a really awkward conversation. So sometimes it's about the commercial deal, and sometimes it's just lawyers being lawyers. Well, the lawyers being lawyers, but you can kick into the long grass and go, I'm not playing that game. Let's just do a deal. The commercial stuff, then that's them changing the deal. That's where you want to go, well, hang on, that's not the deal I've agreed. This is a deal I've agreed, and you've not reflected it correctly in this contract. Don't redline it, because that's what I've written in. Right. So, there are different nuances to why redlining happens. Some of it is just a power play. Right. But if they power play on clauses which aren't that important, then you can concede, which is good. But the problem is, if you've actually been through this process of drafting a decent contract, there is nothing in there that is not important, because you've already made those decisions.
Okay, that's where I wanted to get to. So if it's just the power play stuff and it's not a big deal, let them have it.
Just have it.
If it's on page one, that's what you're agreeing with the customer. That's different. That's not a lawyer redlining it. Now that's just changing the terms, and you need to have a discussion with the customer. Completely. If it's other things, again, it's not the legalese anymore, but let's call it page 2 and beyond, things like that. You make a judgment call. Yeah. Do you need to power play back to them, or can you say, you know what? Okay, that's fine. Not a big deal. Let's move forward. Because there are some human nature things that say some people just need to get something back. They can't accept it the way it is. They need to get something back. I have this when I talk about discounting and negotiating. There are certain cultures where it doesn't matter about affordability. If they didn't get something back, they don't feel like they got a deal. So always have something, if that's the world that you play in. But okay, so redlining, if it's not a big deal, let them have it. If it, again, not legal advice here, talk to your lawyers, but use your judgment on this. And if it's actually affecting it in a way that would harm you, you can say no.
Yeah.
You can say no, because I'm not saying power play back, but it's your sandbox and your toys. And if they want to play in it, they have to play by your rules.
And never, ever accept the explanation that all the other people have signed up to this. Right. Because I don't care what other people sign up to, because it's not about them. This is a two-way deal between two parties. If the two parties aren't interested, we don't have to do the deal. We can learn to walk away from the really terrible deals, because that will give us the time, the energy, and the enthusiasm for the really positive deals. But you know what? If they want to play that game, well, sometimes I'm out.
Right. And sometimes we need to walk away. So Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. 500 words. Where would people find out more about you?
So I'm on LinkedIn. I have a website, 500words.co.uk. And I have books, but they're really relevant to people in the construction sector, which is my specialist expertise.
Okay, but if they did want to follow you on LinkedIn, they can find you there. We'll have all that in the show notes. I appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us and your humor. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Alan. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Wedding Business Solutions podcast. If you liked it, please subscribe to this channel and post a review on your chosen platform, Apple Podcasts or whichever one. If you have any questions about anything in this episode or any of my episodes, email me directly at alan@weddingbusinesssolutions.com or visit my website, alanberg.com, alanberg.com. If you have any suggestions for future topics or guests that you'd like to see, please again, email me or visit my website. Thanks for listening.